this meeting. So please bear that in mind, and do by all means keep your videos off. And second of all, we're going to have some questions, and we've enabled the chat function, so you should all be able to do that. And if you want to pose a question for Dr. Wainwright, then please do use the chat function, direct it towards me as the host, Bath Centre for Pain Services. My name is Jeremy, and I will collate questions and put them to Elaine at the end. So I think that's the bits and bobs. I think we'll just get on, and it'd be lovely to actually introduce Elaine, who, now Elaine, if we look back, Dr. Wainwright did her PhD at the renowned Centre for Pain Research at the University of Bath, and she's now reader in applied psychology at Bath Spa University. Now she has lots of collaborations, not least with us, I have to say, but also she's a co-investigator at the Centre for Excellence for Musculoskeletal Health and Work at Southampton. She's a chartered psychologist, and her key research interest is on how occupation matters when you think about pain across the lifespan, and particularly around return to work and staying at work processes for people living with chronic pain. So I could say many more things about Elaine, but I think it probably instead I will hand over and let Elaine get going. So welcome to Dr. Wainwright.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, for that really kind introduction. If anything goes wrong, please just pop me a chat, because we have got builders next door, but I'm hoping you can't hear them. I can only just hear them, so it should be all right. But it's lovely to be able to talk to you today. I'm going to try and talk for about 35-40 minutes, and then I'd be really interested to have a discussion with people about what you think about what I'm going to say. So I'm hoping to persuade you that occupation matters for pain and pain for occupation, and that there is a real value to taking a lifespan development approach to this issue. I really have to start by thanking lots of different people. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is from this book here, Work in Pain, a Lifespan Development Approach. Many of you will know Professor Christopher Eccleston, who heads the Centre for Pain Research here at Bath. And this book kind of came about partly from my PhD, of which he was one of the lead supervisors, and some general conversations we were having about what work looks like and what good work looks like when you have pain. So I just want to take a moment to thank the Centre for Pain Research and Chris, my co-editor for this book, who also wrote 3 of the chapters as well. And again, I can't possibly read out all of their august titles and where they all are now, because otherwise we'll be here for a very long time because they're so renowned. But it's important I say the names and thank the amazing chapter authors of the people whose work I'm going to celebrate. I won't be able to go through it all in detail, of course, but I'm hoping to provoke you from sharing some of their amazing ideas and their research, and also from sharing the discussion chapter that Chris and I wrote about what this and where we might be able to go next and what we know. So here we've got Mike Calnan and Tom Douglas at the top, who wrote a lovely sociological chapter about work for us, and Abby Jordan and Tina Yaniste, who together wrote a fantastic set of theses about pain in the family and parenting and young children, and then Lena Cass and Deirdre Logan, who did a chapter on school. And all of this I'm going to come back to as I go through. And then Emma Fisher, who many of you know, and Chris Eccleston together wrote a beautiful chapter on millennials and what it means to be a millennial in pain. Josper Beek, whether or not pain is occupational. Then Michael Sullivan, Stefania Pimentel and Catherine Pare, moving along there, together wrote about the psychology of pain-related disability. Chris Main and Bill Shaw wrote a chapter on what it means from an employer and employee perspective to manage pain-related issues at work. And last but not least, Steve Bevan wrote a wonderful treatise about policy and the policy landscape and how that impacts on where we are, particularly in the UK. So I just want to say an enormous thank you to all of the chapter authors and to Chris, my co-editor, else I wouldn't be able to be sitting here talking to you. So you can see in the middle, I've got this lifespan development approach bubble, because really I'm going to focus a lot of what I'm saying about the value of taking a lifespan development interactional approach to this question about what is the effect of pain on occupation, why should we care about any of this, and what do we know about good work and good occupation when we have pain, what helps and where we should go next. So that's my kind of basic structure of what I'm going to be talking about. And I'm not going to have time to get into the real nitty-gritty about exactly what is work versus occupation. The book was called Work and Pain, but actually we're talking about lots of different kinds of meaningful occupative lives in the book. So we do cover some work about children and schooling. And if you think about casting parenting, for example, as labour, what that means to parent a child in pain, and if you're in pain yourself, how that might interact with the labour market. So we took a very broad meaning. We didn't just look at paid work. We were thinking essentially about meaningful occupation across the lifespan. So why should we take a lifespan development approach to this issue? And I think, it probably won't come as a surprise to lots of us that pain is a major part of childhood for many people. So you can see some recent studies there by Sarah King, Gabina and so on, who found between 25 and 44% of adolescents have reported experiencing chronic pain in the past few weeks in these big studies. And that's really concerning. And even more concerning is there's evidence between about 8 to 10% of these children and adolescents report that the impact of pain is disabling. And I think it's really important to think about not just the prevalence and the incidence, but the impact of pain on young people. Probably I could sum up virtually the whole talk with the next bullet point in some way, but that's evidence that pain-free life expectancy is reduced by earlier pain experience. And I think that's worth just letting that sink in for a minute. That's a really high quality study finding that your pain-free life expectancy is shorter if you have earlier pain experience. And you can see how that might play out across the lifespan. And of course, there's a wealth of evidence of the effect of pain on different kinds of occupation. So whether we're talking about schooling or working at home, or different kinds of paid work, I've already mentioned parenting, or people in later life production who often might be working or being busy in the context of a long-term condition. But these kinds of busyness, these kinds of activities are really critical to our life and our goals and our values, and pain disrupts them. Also, thinking about a lifespan development approach to work and pain, we need to stop and think about work for a minute. So Mike Calnan and Tom Douglas wrote a wonderful sociological analysis, really, of the change and the continuity and the consequences of change and of continuity in our working lives. And in the literature which they reviewed and critiqued, you get lots of themes about the vast pace of change that we're all in. And, particularly this year, it's quite weird thinking back to their chapter, which came out in January this year, and then obviously everything that's happened to all of us since then, because they talk about working from home. They talk about tech revolutions over the past 20 years. And even now we're doing this, mediated virtually, whereas perhaps we would have been doing it face to face a year ago. They talk about the gig economy and the extending working life agenda. And there is this sense of the vast pace of change in our working lives, and also fragmentation as people have portfolio careers and precarious work, as well as more traditional working lives. But there is also some continuity in that most people are still in some way selling their labour, and they may have more or less control over that. And most people get meaning and identity from work, and conversely, worklessness is highly problematic for losing identity, particularly in our society. And another point of continuity is this continuing drive for good work and what that means for our health. And I have to say, I feel very, very privileged and lucky to even mention sort of positivity in work in the context of the news we've just had today, for example, about Debenhams and Arcadia yesterday, and how serious it is for people to have a job, any job. But it's still important to take the opportunity as we try and salvage working lives for as many people as possible to think about job design, because we know that good work is good for our health, which I'll come back to. But just the sort of point that I suppose we're relatively lucky that it's relatively recent, and there's a Western bias here, or has been up until more recently, to be able to have the luxury almost to think about work in these terms. But we are, and let's continue this drive for good work for health. But because work is changing, we need to map the lifespan of work against the lifespan of ourselves, if you like. So it's a very complex picture. And then into that picture, we need to add in, well, how do we think about pain? And how do we think about pain at work? And again, on this slide, there's a lot of information, so I'm going to slow down and try and let it sort of sink in, both defining pain per se, but also thinking about it at work. So I think probably a lot of people on the call will be very familiar with the classic IASP definition of pain. But when I teach health psychology to first-year undergraduates, they're really interested in some of those elements when it talks about pain having actual or potential tissue damage or being described in terms of those damage. Because straight away, it's obviously bringing to the fore the ideas about the articulation that perhaps the person living with pain is being asked to do and what problems there might be for that. And particularly thinking for working age adults and thinking about some of the work I've done with sick mystification, how problematic or otherwise it can be for a pain patient to articulate what's going on for them, and for the healthcare professional over the desk, or these days mediated by the screen, to really equitably assess what kind of limitations are going on for this person. More recently, Amanda Williams and co have proposed this definition, really highlighting the social and cognitive elements of pain and the sensory. And again, thinking about work or occupation or school, these are such social settings, these are such cognitive settings. I think it's really important to take notice of those elements when we're thinking about pain and work. And in the Pain Centre here in Bath, there's a big drive to think about pain from a motivational perspective. So Abby Tabor, Chris Eccleston, Ed Keir and others have written so eloquently about this idea that pain can be seen as always embodied, this kind of action against uncertainty. So you as the organism are always striving to protect yourself from inferred threat. And as I say that, you can hear how exhausting that is for somebody to do. And then you're mapping that onto the workplace again with all of the cognitive and social demands that that has. And again, it's a very complicated, challenging picture. So that leads me into thinking about work by Tonya Palermo and others who have talking about pain's function, and yes, reporting its prevalence, but also its severity and its impact on people's lives being really important. So I guess I can sum up this slide by thinking that we can think about pain and occupation from an individual perspective and the person's webbed lived experience, if you like, and the people around them, whether that's their teachers, their parents, their co-workers, or what's going on for them. We can think about it at a social level. So what does your society value or not value for people in pain? And that brings in some difficult political, with a small and a big P, aspects. We can think about it from a global level in terms of inequality for pain treatments, and inequality also of work and good work. So there's lots and lots and lots of complicated, interesting ways to think about pain and try and map that onto our working lives. So in terms of who does get it and thinking about impact, again, lots of people will be really aware of Harold Brevik's massive European surveys. And in a nutshell, about 20% of people, about 1 in 5, have reported pain lasting 6 months or more. And unsurprisingly, about a fifth of those also report being depressed. I also mentioned in children, the Sarah King review, that found about a quarter of children were reporting ongoing and problematic pain. And between about 8 to 10% of those are particularly talking about it being disabling. And this brings me back to this point that probably I'm labouring, but I think it's really important in a work context, about the impact of pain. So how is it impacting your cognitive processes? How is it impacting your affective processes and your feelings in the workplace, whatever workplace is, which is of course very complicated in itself. If we think about the effect directly then for a minute of pain on occupation, there's a wealth of evidence here, and this is where I'm going to bring in some of the chapters. So I showed you the picture earlier of Abby Jordan and Tini Aniste, and they wrote a wonderful chapter looking at the impact of being a child and being a parent when the child has pain, and perhaps also when the parent has pain as well. And we know that chronic pain can disrupt development for children in terms of their independence and their identity formation, impacting on sleep and social functioning. And Abby and Tina wrote very eloquently about the challenges of parenting a child in pain. And again, if you cast parenting as labour, we want to do well in that role. We want to do well in our work as parents. And that can be very difficult when there's a pain condition in the family, whether it's you, your child, both of you. There's a lot to think about. And that's before you even think about mapping your own sense of a worker on top of that, and you as a parent interacting with the labour market. And one of the systematic reviews that Abby and Tina cited is really clear about these very complex bidirectional relationships between pain and family functioning and all the different interwoven aspects that go with that. So the impact on childhood and parenthood is immense. Ditto with schooling. Again, I'm cheekily summing up some of Lena Cass and Deirdre Lodren's work just in that one picture, but they paint a very serious picture about impacts for children in pain on not only school attendance, but their academic performance and, of course, their social interaction as an absolutely critical part in their development. And that also reminds me of something that Mike Cowan and Tom Douglas talked about in their chapter about the need for children who are maybe 15, 16 in pain to have very rigorous and very nuanced careers advice these days when they're thinking about transitioning out of school and into a workplace that is more and more complicated and fragmented. So again, there's a lot to bring together in this picture of the impact of pain across the lifespan, particularly at these key kind of transition points. We think about it for millennials. So this is Emma Fisher and Chris Eccleston's fantastic chapter about millennials, which quite a few people have really highlighted actually to me in tweets and messages. They found this really interesting, that we need to think about the socioeconomic effects on generational behaviour. So there's a lot in certain kinds of literature about how changes in health and education and wealth and labour affect different cohorts, but actually there isn't very much in the clinical and medical psychological literature about how millennials as a cohort experience and cope with pain and how they access healthcare information compared to other generations. There is some interest. There's been some wonderful studies recently looking at anger and disappointment in millennials who are living with pain. And there are some interesting longitudinal analysis that show that young people with ongoing pain are less likely to attain a college degree. But as Emma and Chris have written, there is actually very little understanding of the broad psychosocial impacts of being a millennial in pain. And we're missing a trick there. We're missing a trick to understand this group. And I should say, this made me very, very old when I thought about this. I couldn't remember exactly when millennials are born. And so some of you may know that they're born roughly 1980 to 1990. Sometimes they're called Generation Y or emerging adults, and they're broadly considered to come into adulthood about the year 2000 or a bit after. And just made me feel old because I'm no longer in that group at all, never was. But there's a really big opportunity here to think about how it is to be a millennial in pain compared to other cohorts, and what kind of changes in the labour market and in the health marketisation, for example, have impacted how you experience pain. And we just don't know very much about it. But we do know a lot more about paid work. There's a lot of studies here about paid work, and unsurprisingly, going back to Howard Brevik's survey, about 50% of people who work with pain say it interferes with their work. And systematic reviews have found almost all studies that consider an association report a negative impact. This work I've cited by Gwenwyn Jones at Keele, amazing researcher up at Keele, is old but still the same. Actually, if you look at the data, so-called minor musculoskeletal health conditions, I don't like that word minor, but that's the word that sometimes comes up in the policy literature, particularly because it usually means anxiety and depression and mental health conditions that don't have much psychotic aspects to them. But those kind of anxiety and depression and MSK, musculoskeletal pain, in the UK is nearly always the second most frequent reason for being sick listed and not able to go to work. So, it's a really enormous group of people that we're talking about here. And one of the things that I did in my PhD was do a quite sociological analysis using quite classical stigma terms from Goffman about the kind of role disruption that goes on for people who are managing ongoing pain in work. And just to give you one example from that study, the thing that I still remember is talking to a really quite young person who was working full-time, but said that they were working full-time at the expense of absolutely everything else in their life. So their role disruption wasn't actually in the workplace. They were being perceived as a good worker and they were maintaining their work, but they were coming home and they were exhausted and they were not able to participate in any kind of social interaction, or at the weekend they were just recovering, and so on and so forth. And I remember feeling very humble as that person talked to me in the interview about this kind of covering up in order to not be stigmatized at work because of the moral implications that they felt there were from that. But they even emailed me after the study was over and said, I really want you to know this. I really want you to know I am working at the expense of everything else. So even for people that are working, there's some difficult issues going on behind the scenes. And then Chris's chapter looked at the impact of pain on occupation and meaningful work in later life production. So I've already talked about how concepts of work are changing or in flux, but so too actually is the concept of later life. So the really influential treatise in 2016 called 100 Years Life, I think it is, provides some evidence that people who are born in 2010 and onwards can really expect to live to be 100. So if we bear that in mind, it seems very outdated to think of older workers and retirees being 60 or 65 and so on. So if those concepts of work and later life are in flux, if we're in pain too and we're in later life or so-called later life, how far are we willing and able to work, given that about 50% of older people report bothersome pain? And in that chapter, Chris talks about the biomedical challenges of pain to aging well, but focuses a lot on the psychological identity management challenge of pain to aging well, and how you still need, of course, psychologically meaningful goals in your occupative life. And maybe you can't engage with the kind of work that you have been doing up until then, as your pain condition is perhaps getting slightly more difficult to manage. But perhaps there's a role there, which I'll come on to later, for occupational, relational CBT as well, to help address some of these issues. But there is a big challenge of pain to aging well that increases as we age. So why should we care about any of this then, I suppose, is a question. Sometimes I say that to students, you know, you've given me this treatise, this thesis, why should we care about this? And I guess the answer, which probably this is wisdom as old as the hills, but there's some really strong evidence for it, that good work or good occupation can mediate some of the damage that living with ongoing pain does. And I'll talk a bit about that. And I'll talk about what we know about what good occupation is when we have pain. And then really I'll think about where next for, you know, the last 10, 15 minutes. So why should we care about all of these impacts on pain that I've been sharing, that our chapters covered in such detail and such thought-provoking writing? Well, I always show this picture when I do a talk, and actually it's really difficult to find. You have to be so careful these days with copyright. It's got to be Google free and share even commercially and so on and so on. But actually I've stuck with this picture of somebody at work or busy who's struggling, because yes, it is literally a white collar picture, and I still like the import. I still feel that the emotion that picture shows of somebody hunching, and you can see how they're feeling, even though you can't see their face. It's a very strong picture. So despite all of us sometimes feeling like this about our occupation and our endeavours, essentially we know that good work is good for us. And again, this is the second slide that I tend to show when I'm thinking about work in pain, because there's such good evidence. Here are my happy workers. And again, I like this picture because they're doing something that's quite hard. It's outside. They do generally look happy, they look together, they look like they're a team. And that picture speaks to me in terms of what I'm trying to get at when I think about what is good work. So one of the things good work is from Waddell and Burton's seminal review, is work that is physically and psychologically safe. That's the kind of basic bottom line. And we know from work by them, Carol Black, Black and Frost, more recently Matthew Taylor, that work, you know, we probably do know this intuitively, but really high quality evidence that work is critical for identity management and positive self-regard. Interestingly, not quite for absolutely everybody. So Waddell and Burton make some important caveats about health selection effects that might be operating. And, you know, even good work might not be the answer for absolutely everybody, but they talk about how it probably is for about 90 to 95% of us from that huge review that they do. Again, that can be difficult if you're having a one-to-one interaction with somebody, perhaps you're a healthcare professional or an occupational specialist, to pick up which group that person is in. But it's useful to know that good work is good for people when they have pain too. For example, some of Stephen Bevan's studies cited there at the bottom have shown that good work can reduce the risk for somebody in pain of developing a comorbid mental illness, for example, because of the psychological and obviously fiscal benefits as well. Carol Black talks about the double generational effect. So you having good work is good for your children and your grandchildren. Good occupation, similarly good for us. I probably mentioned most of the things I wanted to say about this slide in terms of having a positive schooling experience with your attendance, whether that's virtually these days or actually, but your social engagement and your action with your peers. and casting yourself as a parent, and how that could be, sometimes it's very, very difficult to be a parent or a carer, as anybody who's listening who is a parent or a carer will know. But also if we're casting ourselves, if we're casting parenting as labour, then it can be really good for us and really important and really meaningful, in fact central to our lives. Ditto for paid work, that age-old chestnut about what do you do being such a key question in our culture. And I already mentioned the importance of having psychologically meaningful occupative goals when you're in later life production, whether that's grandparenting or voluntary work or wanting to carry on with the job you were doing. Thank you very much. So good occupation is good for us. So what is that then? What is good work or good occupation when we have pain? What do we know about that? And what do we know about what helps? And then I'll finish. I'm just looking at the time. I'm about halfway through, but I want to spend quite a lot of time thinking about what helps and then where next. And then I'd really love to get your views. So some of the things that we know about good work, this first slide is for everybody, although some of it's also for people in pain. The second slide is for people in pain specifically. I already mentioned the first bullet point, that the bottom line is it's got to be physically and psychologically safe. So again, thinking back to some of the studies I've done, talking about people who worked for pubs, which is really problematic today, thinking about what's happened to pubs necessarily perhaps, but it's very sad for the people who work in the pubs. But 2 years ago, I remember interviewing people for a study who did work in a pub, and they were talking about some of the difficulties of handling the alcohol and handling the barrels and all those kind of things, and what kind of accommodations could and couldn't be made. But actually also I remember one participant particularly talking about that, but also talking about how their line manager had been wonderful at coming up with sensible, sustainable workplace accommodations for them so they could continue that work, and that's what they wanted to do. Matthew Taylor talks about work being fair and decent, which are old-fashioned words perhaps, but I think so important. Fairness and justice. Lots of you will know Joanna McParland's wonderful work at Glasgow Caledonian University, also some of it done with Chris Eccleston and others down here in Bath, but looking at justice and people's perceptions of justice and injustice when they have pain. And she's been leading a piece of thinking about how justice and injustice and pain might matter in the workplace, particularly for older people. But Matthew Taylor talks about that your work has to be fair, it has to be decent, and there has to be a realistic scope for you for development and fulfillment, whatever that means in your particular workplace. Of course, these days we have to think about the flexibility of platforms for people who can't work perhaps in traditional ways. And there are lots of interesting studies coming out right now talking about how we're all doing death by Zoom, which I hope is not what you're experiencing right now. But we know that Zoom and virtual life can be really hard. But also there's some interesting small scale work coming out talking about some of the benefits of this for people who suffer with ongoing pain, and that they may be able to participate in ways that are more helpful to them. When COVID hit, there's a study run by IES, the Institute for Employment Studies based in Brighton. Steve Bevan, who is one of our chapter authors, is involved in this study. And they talked about there being an initial MSK spike. So about 60 to 70 people that responded to the first wave of their lockdown work questionnaire were reporting MSK pain. And, a lot of that was around, now I am sitting, my stepson has very kindly let me borrow his room. And I'm sitting at his desk and his chair, so I'm quite lucky, but it's not set up for me particularly well. It's all that kind of working from home adjustment that we've all had to go through. And their very recent data wave showed that that's still a challenge for about 1 in 4 of us. So pain is not going away as an issue. Pain is something that's being really important this year, as well as everything else. An opportunity here in some of Steve Bevan's work, he writes very eloquently about thinking about job design and what we can do to prevent or intervene early, or the role of line managers. That's one I think is really interesting, going back to Tom Douglas and Mike Cownan's chapter about work and bringing that together with Stephen Bevan's chapter. So both talked in different ways about the role of line managers and how they seem to be critical, and still having a good relationship with your line manager still seems to be important to people. So there is some really interesting work going on about what good work means for all of us, and particularly what does it mean then when we have pain. And really here I'm paying particular tribute to Chris Main and Bill Shaw and Steve Bevan's chapters, and some of the bits I wrote as well, talking about what we know about early intervention. and having engaged schools and leadership, but also the real importance of around that, having organisational leadership to support what people on the ground might be experiencing and doing to help somebody with pain have a sustainable working life. And on top of all of that, we've got this big kind of socio-political alignment that we need to be able to enact some of the things that we want to do, or perhaps we need to butt against it sometimes. So I'll talk about, I've got really sort of two more things. I'm just checking the time. I've got some things to tell you about what we know about what helps, and then really some questions to ask you about the things we think we don't, or the things we know we don't know. Don't want to get too Donald Trump, Bush, you know, the great unknowns and the knowns and all the things we know and we don't know. But there are some things that we do know that we don't know that we need to know. And also I have some sort of broader questions, I guess, for everybody that we think are important, that would be really useful to get your reflections on in terms of where perhaps we could go next with all of this. So what helps? And again, I could have talked for hours just about this. I'm just giving you a taste of this. But there is some really good evidence that early intervention for people with musculoskeletal disorders who are employed but struggling is really important. And there are so many studies I could have picked here. I could have picked, for example, the SWAP trial that, again, probably lots of you have come across up at Keele with Brenwyn Jones, Nadine Foster and everybody, that have found it's effective and cost effective to get in with really early vocational rehabilitation support. So when somebody goes to their general practitioner and has a pain condition, you can have that specialist occupational support straight away. And in that study, that was physios and actually a nurse who were delivering that kind of vocational rehabilitation intervention. There are other studies that show, for example, that having on-site work collaboration between the person, perhaps the healthcare professional, if they're involved, which they nearly always are, and the manager, can, you know, the one trial here particularly that I've pulled out that showed a wonderful effect of reducing sick leave and also lost work productivity by more than half. And there's some good cost effectiveness data again. A couple of systematic reviews I've been involved with, and here I need to pay tribute to my fantastic PhD student Paula Ben-Shenik, who did an enormous piece of work, and it's her first author publication from her PhD, so I'm terrifically proud of her. And what she did was look at tertiary level interventions for back to work with pain. I'd previously, the year before, taken a slightly different slant with a group, and we'd looked at interventions that were loosely grouped about psychological constructs of resilience and what might help people get back to work. But one of the common findings across all of our reviews is, in a nutshell, a lot of it came down to multidisciplinary treatments. Of course, these can be quite expensive. And again, the Keele group are doing some wonderful work about stepped care models, as are some other groups in the country, in the UK, and where we can use those very appropriately. But essentially, it was multidisciplinary treatments with cognitive behavioural therapy in most of them that seemed to be the most effective. There are questions here about what kind of cognitive behavioural therapy. So, you know, there's a big piece of work here to do, getting manuals and having a look at exactly what was going on. And then more than that, there's another piece of work to do to think about what kind of psychological mechanisms lie behind the interventions that actually do work, which again, Joanna McParland in Glasgow Caledonian has been leading some very important thinking about. So there is some good evidence about what might help people in the workplace. Actually, interestingly, both of the reviews I've been involved with have found the median age is about 42. So a lot of the evidence is around people that kind of age. And again, thinking about the millennials and the children who are maybe 17, 18 coming out of school and wanting to transition into the labour market, and also thinking about older people, the evidence is not as strong, and that's a problem. But sticking to the positives for a minute, I don't know if people have come across individualised placement support, which is a type of intervention which has a really strong evidence base for people who are living with mental health conditions, but only just starting to have an evidence base for people living with ongoing pain. So this can be used for people who are not employed, but are expressing some kind of interest usually, or inkling that getting back into employment might be something they want to do. And it is, as the name suggests, a very individualised setup where you have one-to-one support with an employment support worker who may or may not be medically trained. There are different models being trialled at the moment. And the idea is you sit down and you really unpack what is it that you want to do and what is it you can do. And these IPS trials have employers already on board with different kinds of jobs and different kind of accommodations that can be offered, and the employers are also trained. The ESWs, the employment support workers, in some of the papers I've cited there, had training from occupational therapists and from pain specialists. So again, there are kind of questions here about what kind of training and role people who deliver this kind of support could have. But again, some really positive results so far. So that picture there is Professor Karen Walker-Bain, who heads up the Centre for Musculoskeletal Health and Work at Southampton. And she's telling us at one of our annual scientific days about some of the wonderful results that people are having from IPS work. But we also need to take that forward. So I'm just checking the time. So we need to think about, for example, one of the things I'm involved in that centre is whether or not we can take those ESWs and put them into GP surgeries, what that might look like, particularly now. So what would occupational health for all look like now, given everything that's going on for everybody in primary care and in secondary care? Very difficult with everything that we've been through, but also some really positive results to build on. The only other thing I guess I should say about IPS, if people don't know about it, is it's definitely a place and train model. So it's definitely about getting people back into competitive paid employment. So you place them carefully with their co-created supports from them and from the employer in a suitable role, and then you support them in that role over quite a long period of time. But it's called place and train because it is very focused on placing people in competitive paid employment as opposed to voluntary employment, just because of some of the evidence from other literatures that seems to have better outcomes for health and keeping your job in the end. That's not to do down at all the role of voluntary work, but IPS particularly is about competitive paid employment. So a sort of note of caution before I'm going to talk for about another 10 minutes and then stop and get some questions and some comments. I have stolen this diagram shamefully from developmental psychology and from Bronfenbenner, if any of you have come across this before, because I just want to make the point that all of these things I'm talking about are complicated. So Bronfenbenner has the child at the centre, and he talks about the microsystem and the impact on the child and the things bearing down on the child, such as their peers and their family. Right out, you can see there to the macro system and the attitude of the culture. But I find this diagram really useful to think through some of the issues that are complicated in terms of pain and work, because again, a lot of the trials don't report things like, do the people want to be back in that job or a different job, or where is the financial impetus, or what kind of support have they got from their family and their healthcare professional and so on, and what kind of political and social structure are they sitting in. So that's kind of almost a big caveat, but I do find it a really useful way to remember what's bearing down on somebody, but also, that sounds very deterministic, also how somebody can affect back the system and how somebody can be interactive themselves within the system. So it's not just things bearing down on the person. The arrows are double-headed, and people can, to some degree, influence what's going on around them. Obviously less so in some really serious structural situations, but there are still opportunities. So things are complex. Steve Bevan's chapter talked about this brilliantly, because he took a very broad policy perspective, and he didn't just look at the UK, although he did focus quite a lot of his work on the UK, but he compared the UK to lots of other countries. So I'd encourage you to have a look at his work. And he talks about how we often find a silo of policy. So we have employment policy, which is looking at things like, what does the employer have to do legally? How far do we go with allowing them latitude versus making them do stuff to accommodate someone in pain? We have welfare and active labour market policy. So we have the complicated issues about conditionality for benefits, for example. And as we know, it's really hard to equitably assess that in many cases, and there have been many problems with that. And then we have health policy and the importance of early intervention and general practitioners for children and for adults and those sorts of issues. And we have some things across the middle there that try to cut across these silos, but Steve's work talks about how people in pain often fall between these silos, and we are getting better at joining them up, but it's been a difficult journey. And at the bottom, you know, people in pain, I've put workers, but it could have been people thinking about children too. They are not homogenous, and often you find in the policy landscape, you get, right, this is our policy for people in pain, and that's not to criticise the policymakers. They have to apportion things up somewhere. And I've had some really wonderful conversations with the Joint Work and Health Unit and the Department for Work and Pensions, and I sincerely believe the people I've been working with there are really interested in good work for health and good work for people living with ongoing pain, and not just work. But it is sometimes difficult to remember the homogeneity of workers with pain, and that they are, you know, that they are not homogenous. Sometimes IPS, the placement support scheme I mentioned, helps with that because it is so individualised, and sometimes expert patient programs can help with that because they're explicitly acknowledging perhaps some of the tensions around centralising somebody's narrative of themselves with some of the national initiatives that are going on. So, where next? 5 minutes to talk about where next. Main and Shaw, Chris Main, Bill Shaw wrote a wonderful piece for us, essentially saying, instead of just thinking about back to work or return to work with some of the dichotomy that implies, think about it as a sustained reintegration into work, where you really take on board at different levels the perceptions of the worker and their conditions and what they think are the most demanding things for them. You need to be very open to the line managers and themselves. People talk about the squeeze middle, but actually the squeeze line managers in the middle are really important to think about. Need to train them to take medical advice on fit notes or from wherever else and turn that into accommodations that work for both parties. All of this needs to be backed up by really consistent policies, not just from the top down, the bottom up, but are interwoven at all levels of the organisation. And I think, you know, again, there are big moral questions here about keeping on people and not keeping on people that we need to address. And when we talk about joining up job design and vocational rehabilitation, we need to include all stakeholders in that. So Main and Shaw write about including the worker, but also including colleagues as well when you think about organisational policies, about how we manage pain-related implications at work. And I think there's a lot of really important work that could be done based on Main and Shaw's chapter here. Again, thinking about policy, just to pick out two things that I think Steve Bevan writes about that we need to move forward with. So one is occupational health provision. In the UK, only about 50% of people have access to that through their organisations. And some of the work I've been doing with Southampton is about looking how can we provide occupational health for all, and it is primary care a setting that we could do that in with some of these employment support workers. But also thinking again about some of the contextual specialist careers advice, maybe older children would like when they're coming out of school and transitioning into a very complicated labour market. Is there a role there to think about pain and work? And Steve Bevan poses interesting questions about including work productivity in health technology assessments where we decide, or NICE and governmental policy makers and so on decide what's going to get funded or not. Because sometimes back to work or work-related costs are not included in that, and understandably so, because people worry about only focusing on people who can do paid work. But if you're trying to increase paid work for a greater good, then perhaps there is a role to increase work productivity elements in HTA. I haven't mentioned Jos Verbeek's fantastic chapter, and he takes a very different slant and talks about whether or not the pain is occupational. And he says we don't use that phrase very much in the literature anymore because we tend to talk about pain from where it originates, such as back pain and so on. But actually, you know, it's important to know if pain can be called occupational, if it is to do with the work, because that have such clear implications for how you treat it and how you prevent it, and do you compensate for it or not. Some countries, it really matters in a legal sense whether the pain is deemed to be occupational or not. And I was surprised when I first read his chapter. He points out we don't actually have, and we need large, high quality randomized studies to see if ergonomic interventions have an effect on occupational pain. I'd assumed that was there. again, focusing in on a psychological framework again, Mick Sullivan, Stefania Pimentel and Catherine Pyre wrote a wonderful chapter talking about different kinds of psychological constructs that we know can predict work disability. And to home in on one of those in my title there, negative recovery expectancy, so whether you as a patient expect to go back to work, essentially. And we know that they're one of the strongest psychological predictors of work disability. But along with perceived injustice, self-efficacy, fear avoidance, and so on, it's not clear how far these pain-related psychological constructs overlap and whether or not they're contributing unique variants to this prediction of whether or not somebody will go back to work. So there's a big piece of work that needs doing to sort that out. And then can we design interventions targeting whichever the key psychological variables are, and how we need to know much more about, for example, how do patient negative expectancies about going back to work develop? And I've just finished supporting a wonderful qualitative piece of work nested within a cohort study at Southampton by Lisa Shipway, who I'm delighted to say submitted her PhD this morning, which is a lovely email to wake up to. But she looked at qualitative work around how people decide after arthroplasty, knee replacement, whether or not to go back to work. And there was a lot of interesting themes there about trust in your joint, trust in your healthcare professional, and trust in your family and in your employer. We need to study other kinds of work. So in the discussion, we found very little research on voluntary work, people who are self-employed in precarious situations, or people who want to move from self-employment into mainstream employment. What supports them when they're living with ongoing pain? We know very, very little about that. And thinking about the motivational perspective on pain, how do people manage threats to identity and coherence when they're in pain at work? So I'm really aware of the time. I've got 3 more slides. So these are my questions to leave you with. If we're taking a lifespan development approach, we need to think much more carefully and creatively about a biopsychosocial theoretical framework of school functioning, which Lena Cass and Deirdre Logan put forward, because they point out we don't have a very strong framework in which to understand school functioning at the moment, and some of our measures don't map very well onto each other. And Abby Jordan and Tina Nuniste talk about whether or not and how we can tailor parenting interventions to key parental individual differences and styles, which we know influence dyadic relationships when a child has pain. And there are other questions I mentioned earlier about how to help a parent who's parenting a child in pain negotiate a labour market as well at the same time. And we know very little about intergenerational knowledge and communication about living a good life with pain. We couldn't find anything about backwards transmission from child to adult. And can we use this intergenerational research to think about developing different kinds of beliefs or closing the gap between generational beliefs about analgesia and a good life lived with pain? And last bit, I think the most important thing about this slide that I haven't mentioned, I've probably mentioned the first point about developmental impairments in youth, and if they're associated with chronic pain, do they recover? So how can we support people with negative self-perceptions to recover as they age, and hence support relationships between early academic and later work outcomes? I haven't mentioned enough this idea about can we embed good work or good occupation for health in different settings in a more rigorous way, which a recent paper by Public Health England said is still problematic. And this is my last bit, really. If we're thinking about later life production, we know pain changes engagement with occupation. So I think we need to experiment more. Chris wrote about this, with meaningful identity management regarding which goals we pursue in later life and which we set aside. So can we think about work engagement via assimilation, where people remove barriers and go for great effort for change, but also accommodation, where people might reshape what it means not to achieve that goal. So we can help people in later life production have meaningful occupative goals when they are living with pain. That's really what I wanted to say. The last slide is a picture of, obviously something to do with the lifespan. And I hope I've managed to convince you that taking a lifespan approach might be really useful and important when we're thinking about intergenerational beliefs and behaviours about what is a good life in occupation when you have pain. Thank you. I'll stop sharing. Oh, actually, that's not stop sharing, is it? Oh, yeah, it has. Good.
Well, that was Excellent. Thank you very, very much indeed, Elaine. And the good news is that the chat has been coming in, and there are lots of questions for you, Elaine, and not just questions but also compliments. So a lot of
Thank
people saying
you.
thank you very much for the talk, interested in the topic, and people who've encountered your book who are also really rating the book as well. Very, very helpful. So
Thank you very much for
um,
the comments.
so let me make a start on some of the questions that have come in. So we've talked a huge amount about occupation. Somebody was asking, in the book and in the research around the book, was there any input from occupational therapists? And what do you see about occupational therapists' role in vocational rehabilitation?
Yeah, actually, the short answer for the book is no, although one of the people book review for Oxford University Press, as in not after it came out, but kindly agreed to read the whole thing before it went to the beginning, was somebody who is an occupational health doctor, and she is now on board with a topical review that Chris and I are leading for pain, which is kind of a 3,000 word call to arms really about this. So in the book, you're right, there wasn't a direct chapter by an occupational, vocational or but in this topical review, we have brought her in because we recognise that's another perspective that's really, really important. And she's written for us already a fantastic short piece about how she sees occupational health fitting in and not fitting in. For example, she's talked about how we know quite a lot about lifting for nurses, and that might have worked. That might be dealt with in an occupational setting. So we are trying to bring that in. But the other side of me, quickly to answer that question, is absolutely there is a role for occupational therapists and specialists. I think they're absolutely critical. And some of the work I mentioned with the IPS going on at Southampton it was specifically using people who have occupational therapy experience, either as employment support workers themselves or training up other employment support workers. And I think they're absolutely vital. Do wonderful work.
Okay, thank you. And I can see the enthusiasm coming through on the chat, which is great. Okay. So a couple of other ones. So this one's a little more psychological. So we were talking about variables associated with return to work and negative expectations. Somebody raised the issue of the variable of shame, and whether you knew of any actual research work on shame in a return to work, or what predictions you would make about that as a significant variable.
That's a really interesting point, and straight away I think about overlaps between shame and stigma, and thinking about some of the work in my PhD which talked about people did use the word feeling ashamed, but actually we characterised it according to sociological theory of stigma. But actually there's some work by somebody called Marie, I think it's Barnes, I'll have to check her surname, that's been really interesting, talking about men, particularly in Wales, in some traditional mining industries, and when they're feeling very ashamed of either being unemployed or being ill at work, and some of the strategies they dealt with to manage that shame, in terms of sort of talking themselves down and giving other reasons for why they were in and out of work. But I think that's a really important concept to manage, and actually I've just started working with a wonderful a PhD student called Sarah Harrison, who is actually an occupational health specialist herself. And we're going to be looking at why people do or don't disclose that they have rheumatoid arthritis to their employer, and how that interacts with the workplace and the professional. She's just starting a scoping review on that, and already I think there's some literature by Gina Natel coming out talking about shame. So I do think that's going to be a really important, delicate thing to address.
Okay.
We have a moral view, I guess, don't we? We unfortunately in our often have a moral view of work and not working, and that's really important to tackle. I suppose that's what I was trying to think about when I was thinking very much about this year and what is work versus what is good work, and people feeling ashamed of losing their jobs through no fault of their own, and what we do with that as a society is really important.
Okay, thank you. Now a couple of questions came through in the what could we do and what could we do better category. We talked about, you mentioned that, mid to late teenagers might need some bespoke careers advice.
Yeah. Yeah.
given their specific issues with chronic pain and the specific issues of the labour market. Do you have any idea what that careers advice would look like?
Well, funny, actually, Emma Fisher, Abby Jordan, and some Charlotte Wilson, Dara Berta, and Harini Medfax-Sundaram and I, a group of us have been just doing a small quality study that was just about finishing writing up. And the reason I mentioned that, we asked 14 to 18-year-olds who were either self-identifying as having pain or not, just to talk about future worries. And we didn't specifically work and careers, and that came through absolutely loud and clear that the children who self-identify as having in pain were already projecting way into the future and thinking about how pain might interfere with their career. So this is just a very small initial pilot study to try and work out what's going on for them. And I'd pay very strong tribute here to Abby Jones's work and some of her future storytelling for people with CRPS that I know people on the call have probably been involved with. I think that's the first step, is to take that work, put it together with the work by Lena Cass and Deirdre Logan, who looked at schools from a systems perspective and how best to support teachers. And then the short answer is I don't know yet, but we need to put work together and find out from the young people themselves what's going on and what they need, and then from the teachers what they can do, and then from a systems perspective get the organizational structures behind it. I don't think we have it yet.
Okay, thank you. And sticking with the young people theme, if you have a young person with chronic pain, some of them are in formal schooling and some of them are homeschooled. Are we aware of any views on how those two different options affect the transition into career and work?
Actually, I have to say I haven't read anything directly on that, and that's a really important, interesting question. Again, thinking about some I have seen recently that homeschooling has gone through the roof this academic year. The authors of that said probably related to COVID and that people have been home and seen it can be done at home. I have to say that was not my experience, but that's a whole other story. The very short answer is no. I don't know of any direct research on that. I'm sorry, but again, I think that's a really important question that needs to be answered, and there's enough here to keep us busy to enable young people with pain to have a smoother transition into this complicated labour system we're in.
Thank you. And I think there's probably one last what could we do differently question, which is, I mean, we've mentioned the issues of benefits assessments, the DWP, the fit note, and how hard it is for people with chronic pain to communicate and to get the conditions seen as legitimate. I know you've done some work with the DWP. Do you know how this can be done better?
I guess, I mean, the positive side of it, as I say, is every single interaction I've had with them, and this is not trying to make a political point, but it has been very positive, that I think they're really on board with the idea that perhaps you could argue for fiscal as well as social reasons, we do want this to be done better and we do want this to be done well. So a specific example with the fit note would be that we know secondary care doctors don't use it very much because they tend not to see it as part of their role. But an example of that would be perhaps a rheumatologist might have an amazing interaction with a patient, but then the patient goes back to the general practitioner in many cases to get the fit note done. And there's a piece of work actually Sarah Dorrington and co have been looking at around that. So how can we support secondary care doctors who have so much going on for them already to think about work as a health outcome and use the fit note in a clinical setting, and that might be a really important way forward. There's also very briefly a piece of work that I'm looking at with Southampton based on something David Cogging just said about offer vignettes to GPs. So we're trying to think about an experimental study of what might help GPs who are also obviously under such enormous demand. What kind of questions might predict work disability, and then can we use those fit note consultation better?
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, I'm aware we've gone through till 5 o'clock. And so I think probably what we'll do is we will say thank you once again to Elaine for a really, really terrific talk, really interesting and a lovely, lovely set of questions. So just from my point of view and from the point of view of the Pain Forum, we'll send a message around to everybody who had a ticket with details of a link to the recording of this video who you can pass on selectively if you want to, for people who missed it. And for future Pain Forums, we're hoping for one in March, April, then please stay in touch. We will email people, but one of the best things to do is to look at the Bath Centre for Pain Services Twitter feed, which is at BCPS Bath. Thank you for so many people coming, and thank you for the lovely, grateful and appreciative messages that are coming through on the chat now. Elaine, hugely appreciated, and thank you for a lovely turnout on an excellent topic. We will very much.
Thank you from me, just for your time, Jeremy, and everybody's time for listening and coming.
Lovely. Lovely. Well, I think it's been mutually satisfactory. So we will sign off now and say thank you and have a great evening to everybody. Okay. Bye-bye.